will be a challenge in itself. Jedediah Strong Smith. I don't know how much names affect you, but I think in his case it might have had some effect. Many of you are familiar with this man, so I'll just give you a quick sketch of why he's remembered. He was a hunter, a trapper, a fur trader, a trailblazer, an author, a cartographer. He was the first of many accomplishments now on the United States side of things. You see, he's kind of the answer to David Thompson. Not that they were in competition, but he lives at the same time. You can see he was born in 1799, the year that Thompson married. He died in 1831. So Jedediah Smith, only about 30 years old at the time of his death, is sort of planted right in the middle of the longer career of Thompson, but does in many ways the same thing in a more southerly venue, more in what we would call America or the United States then. Thompson was more Canadian. Smith was the first to cross overland from Salt Lake to California. He was the first American to cross the Sierra Nevada and the Great Basin, that kind of great vast wilderness area there. He was the first to reach Oregon country from California. He discovered the South Pass to Oregon Territory, which became very significantly part of what was called the Oregon Trail years later. But above all of that, he was a man of passionate, devoted, consistent, and conspicuous Christian faith. And I think anyone that knew him was immediately impressed with the fact that that was something that was not the least bit secret about him. A book written by Robert Cleland entitled This Reckless Breed of Men, a book about mountain men in general, said of Jedediah Smith, perhaps the greatest of all American mountain men, was devout a Christian as a Scotch Covenanter. We talked about the Scotch Covenanters earlier, and they were conspicuous for their passionate Christian devotion, and Smith was certainly cut out of the same kind of cloth. Smith's own journal is peppered with references to his Christian understanding and Christian commitment. This is simply typical. How often, he writes, ought we on our bended knees to offer up our thanks for the gift of his dear son. Smith's story begins in Bainbridge, New York. He descended from Huguenots. We've talked about them earlier, those French Calvinists who were persecuted and really spread throughout parts of Europe and eventually came to the United States. He, however, encountered his first experience of real Christian understanding from the Second Great Awakening, which took place in the New England states and was more or less pushed by Methodist preachers who at that time were ferocious and emotional and effervescent, and so that was kind of the spiritual heritage really that he had from his own childhood as he was growing up. Along with his interest in the Christian faith, he had a very deep interest in nature and in adventure, which is probably true of many young boys and so on, but this was fueled by a book that he received from a guy named Dr. Titus Simmons, which happened to be the journals of Lewis and Clark. Lewis and Clark, of course, did their famous excursion 1804 to 1806, when about 10 years later, Jedediah Smith was in his teenage years. He received a copy of this. It was at least taken for granted that Smith carried with him two books throughout his career. One was the Bible and the other was the journals of Lewis and Clark. That was what he did as his daily devotions, read those two books, you know. The Smith family was never wealthy, at least at the beginning. They left New York, moved to Ohio, really looking for work from there. Jedediah himself moved on to Illinois, and he was scouring the newspaper one morning looking for an ad for help wanted, dishwasher, something like that, you know. And he saw an ad placed by a guy named General William H. Ashley. Ashley was advertising for adventurous young men. This is what it said. 2, enterprising young men. The subscriber wishes to engage 100 men to ascend the river Missouri to its source, there to be employed for 1, 2, or 3 years. For particulars, inquire of Major Andrew Henry, near the Lead Mines in the county of Washington, who will ascend with and command the party, or to the subscriber at St. Louis, William H. Ashley. Well, Jedediah headed right over to his office, stood in his doorway. Ashley looked up and saw this impressive 6-foot-tall, blue-eyed, 23-year-old Jedediah Smith, hired him on the spot. He had an intuition about the man that turned out to be quite accurate. Ashley sent Jedediah off to a kind of boot camp experience at the foothills of the Rocky Mountains near what was called Fort Icarus. And there, Jedediah learned some basic survival skills. He was trained in various sort of frontier skills such as trapping beaver and hunting buffalo and other kinds of practical skills that a person needs to make it in the wild. And then he was called back to the region of the Great River where Ashley himself was organizing his first team to conduct this expedition. As he returned, the group that was there were attacked by some Icarus Indians. Don't know exactly what precipitated this attack, but it took place in 1822. Jedediah Smith, of course, had no military training whatsoever. He was simply a young man, and he conducted himself with a remarkable bravery in the face of this attack that wound up killing 13 of Ashley's men. But as they were fighting and scraping and trying to get out from under this surprise attack, it came to everybody's notice that Jedediah was fighting with a great deal of bravery and throwing himself into harm's way, more or less selflessly giving himself to the task of protecting others. And those who survived, and especially Ashley, noted his conduct. And Ashley not only had him at that point hired, but actually made him kind of a foreman right at that point because of the depth of character that he really saw in him. And he was well received even by men who had greater experience and were older as their natural leader. So he had that kind of personal gravitas that caused people to follow him and trust him. He was immediately given the nickname, the moniker that followed him for the rest of his career, the Praying Trapper. And that nickname was given to him because that was evidently the kind of person he was. He himself, however, felt the loneliness of his circumstances. He wrote a letter to his parents in which he said in part, quote, "I feel the need of the watch and care of a Christian church. Our society is of the roughest kind of men. Men of good morals seldom enter into the business of this kind. I hope you will remember me before the throne of grace." That's the kind of thing he sent to his parents, and it's what makes me think about Paul. Jedediah was separated from Christian fellowship most of his career, and yet at the same time he maintained this very evident devotion to Christ, devotion to a life that was conspicuously reflective of a Christian ethic. And people, though they may not have shared always in that ethic, nevertheless admired him. And he certainly was one they trusted, though he went through a bit of ridicule along the way just because he was such a man. His first great expedition was an attempt to find what was called the South Pass. The North Pass had been mapped out by Lewis and Clark, and of course up in Canada there was another pass, but this was one that would be more or less south of Yellowstone, so he heads off in 1823 on that job. From there he was looking for, of course, a crossing over the Rocky Mountains, and it was on this occasion that one of the most memorable experiences of his life took place, in which he was attacked by a grizzly bear. I happened to be there at the time and caught this photo. It was scary, you know. Anyway, this is probably about what it looked like. Jedediah had no time to respond. This bear came out of the bushes and knocked him to the ground, broke a couple of ribs, clawed across his face, and actually ripped off some of the skin from his face and his ear. Were all sort of dangling there. So it was a vicious attack. And then for some reason, the bear went running off into the wild, and there was Jedediah laying on the ground. Here was the leader of these men, who was there on the ground, more or less at the point of death, and they didn't know what to do because he was their leader. And so in one of the most remarkable moments of his career, which is described by these guys, he began in a kind of cool and calm fashion to tell them how to administer medical care to him. And he told them to go get some water, wash the wounds. At one point, the problem was that his ear was just dangling there by a little thread of skin, and they didn't know what to do. And Jedediah said, "Sew it back on." And They didn't know, he said, get needle and thread and sew the ear back on. So he always had a very strange looking ear for the rest of his career, and actually he lost an eyebrow in it. It did leave some permanent disfigurement, which is why whenever you see pictures of Jedediah Smith, he always has long hair. He was not a hippie. This was just kind of his way of camouflaging some of the damage that was done to him by that grizzly bear when he was just in his 20s. Once he had recovered from that attack, they were able to find themselves among some friendly Crow Indians, and they were asking about the prospect of locating some pass across the Rockies, and the Crow Indians actually were able to give some guidance in that regard. So they crossed through this pass and found themselves on the other side then in the region of Utah. And this leads to what was called the first California trip. Actually sold out, and the company that he owned was purchased at this point by Smith, by a guy named David Jackson, another guy named William Sublette. So the three of them actually became now co-owners of the company that had once hired Smith, and this was in 26. And then Smith, the three of them split up, so each went on their own kind of separate trapping and exploratory excursions. Smith was looking for the legendary Buenaventura River. You know, it doesn't exist, but many people had heard of some kind of legend of a river that flowed from that region down into the Pacific. So Smith was trying to confirm or deny the existence of that river, and in the process of doing so, arrived amongst the Mojave Indians at a time when they were pretty much spent. They had used up a lot of their resources, water was scarce, food was scarce, and Jedediah writes in his journal, "We had lost so many horses that we were now all on foot. My men and the remainder of my horses were worn out with fatigue, and hardships had emaciated with hunger." And again, these friendly Mojave Indians helped them along the way. They provided, through various trades and so on, the resources that they needed to continue. And so on that basis, Jedediah was able to cross the Mojave Desert and reach California. This map, hopefully you can see that the region that I've circled in black there is kind of the general venue where Jedediah was working. So this is what we would call Utah, Southern California. It was more or less where he was. This is a painting by Frederick Remington, 1906, depicting, as he pictured it, this trek across the Mojave Desert. I don't know how much it resembles reality, but I kind of like it, so there it is. He wound up at San Gabriel Mission in California in the fall of 1826. Beautiful place, it's there to this day. The thing you have to keep in mind is that California at this point belonged to the Mexicans, you see, and so he had actually crossed over into foreign country. The Mexican-American War had not taken place yet, and yet they were more or less, having just crossed the Mojave, they were needing some kind of place to land, and this was an inviting place so to do. So they were warmly received by the president of the mission, Jose Bernardo Sanchez, not so warmly received by the Mexican governor, whose name was Jedediah, who believed that Smith and his men were probably spies, because there was rising tension by this time between Mexico and the United States over this real estate that at this point was controlled by Mexico. And so he was very suspicious of any Americans that just came wandering in, and Jedediah Smith looked like someone who might be there for other reasons, even though Smith protested his innocence continually, showed the journals, showed all of his personal effects, none of which betrayed any evidence that he was on some kind of surreptitious mission, but nevertheless, Jedediah was not quite so sure, and Smith was actually arrested and held incarcerated for a period of time. Finally, under pressure, he was moved, that is, Jedediah was moved to release Smith. He ordered him to go back the same way he came and never return, both of which orders Jedediah Smith disregarded.